So, thank you for joining this webinar today. This is basically going to be a pretty, I guess, universal understanding of how we can understand behavior management. And what I'd like to use to do this is I'd like to do it from a particularly RTI lens. So how do we use the response to intervention model to help us understand a little bit more about uh, managing behavior? So we're going to use RTI to inform our practices on managing behavior, and we're going to look at it, we always have to look at it first from a school-wide perspective, and then understand how that trickles down to the classroom. So I like to break this down in terms of what I call assumptions versus realities. So I think a lot of times when our students come to us in school buildings, we have common assumptions about how we expect them to come. What we discover is that there are some immediate realities that aren't what we expected. First and foremost, I think one of the common assumptions is that all students come to school ready and to our classrooms ready to learn, and that just simply is not true. And unfortunately, we discover that pretty early on. It can be very disappointing, I think. The immediate reality is that many of our students come to us and they are completely unprepared for learning. So that gives the job of teaching an extra layer. It becomes not only about teaching content and teaching them to read and teaching them skills, teaching them math, it becomes about teaching them how to behave. So another common assumption is that all students know what's expected of them socially when they come to school. Right? For us, I think sometimes as adults we believe certain things to be common sense. When you're in school, when you're in public, you behave this way, you don't do this, you don't do that. But for many of our students, they require direct instruction on appropriate social interactions and the learning environment. So once again, that extra added layer to our jobs is to not only teach them academic skills, but we have to teach them social and emotional skills as well. Another common assumption is that we can just simply inspire our challenging learners. And if we can inspire them, they'll mend their ways. And I think the reality and the truth really is that inspiring challenging students actually often requires us as adults to mend our ways. And so it's a shift in thinking about how do I change in order to get the results that I want out of my students. And finally, if I speak it, they will listen. Oftentimes, I find one of the biggest challenges in behavior management that I see in classrooms with teachers and with students is that we, as the adults, often talk too much. And if we talk too much, they don't hear us. One ear out the other. So what we are relying on then is not necessarily our words. The words are important. What we're relying on is creating a proactive environment that has all of the necessary components in place where you don't have to do too much talking. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So here's a little graphic that I created that can sort of, I think, frames behavior through the RTI lens. As you can see, and if you've seen an RTI model before, they all use this triangle. They look like this. The most important component is at the bottom, right? This is what we should do for all kids in order to get the results that we're looking for. The idea behind this is that if we do what's good for all students, a good chunk, probably 80% or more of our students, will be able to function successfully in the academic environment. At the top or above that is the second layer. It's much smaller. because these are the things that would be put into place should we have that small, likely 10 to 15% of students who can't function solely with the sort of normal or basic supports, and so they need an extra layer of support to help them function successfully. The third tier then is the most intense supports. So when given all of the options in portions 1 and 2, the 5 to maximum 10% of students who don't achieve given these supports need a little more intensity, okay? And so that's how we frame really providing special education services to students. We like to think of, if we provide the necessary things for all students, majority of students should succeed. If we find that after providing these things, they still don't work, there might be 15% of students who need a little extra support, and then we go up the continuum. So when it comes to behavior, this applies to academics, it applies to behavior as well. So within a school-wide framework, what we should have are some universal things that are required of all students, right? So basically, this triangle represents a pretty sort of solid PBIS plan, or Positive Behavioral Intervention and Supports plan. At the bottom, we have expectations that use positive language. They're accessible to the students. We teach those expectations to the students. We actually practice those expectations with the students. So the example I have here is FDMS, some middle school that I made up, PUMAs, are polite, prompt, and purposeful. Those are the expectations school-wide. Then we teach them what that means in the school, and we practice those expectations with the students. This is intentional teaching, just like we teach science, math, reading, language arts, social studies. We also teach the behaviors that we expect. And yes, I would encourage actually in the form of lessons. We have visuals of those expectations around the building to refer to, and then we make sure that teachers are armed with the tools to respond consistently to those behaviors. So that means that there is already sort of a set of agreed upon consequences that happen for all kids who don't meet the expectations. And then administrators also have a plan for responding consistently to those problem behaviors. Once again, it's a set plan that everyone agrees will be used consistently by everyone, and it generally should work for the majority of the kids. Sometimes in these positive behavioral intervention and support plans, we have currency built in, so the kids can earn bear bucks. At a school in Alexandria, Virginia, Samuel Tucker, they have tiger tickets because they're the Tucker Tigers. So, but you get the gist of how there needs to be a really strong base at the bottom. Oops. Tier 2 are these extra layers. So students who are at risk, not necessarily determined yet to have or need special education services, but need some extra support. This is where our student support teams come into place. These are groups of people who work at creating plans for kids who are struggling. They can do the same for behavior. Counseling, social skills groups can be available to students who are struggling with behavior. Also doing functional behavioral assessments and behavior intervention plans. So we can figure out what behaviors to target and then move on with how to overcome any inappropriate behaviors. Tier 3, these are kids who we've decided, okay, the behaviors are significant enough that regular interventions won't work. The child needs some specialized instruction and supports, and thus they would have an individualized education plan. They would be placed for special education services, and anytime within that process of being in special education, if they end up continuing to have behaviors that are having them removed from school, then we might do a manifestation determination to see if we've if those behaviors are in fact the manifestation of the child's disability. So with all of that said, Tier 1 is the school-wide PBIS. So just to review, these are positive behavioral interventions and supports. The key with all of this is that they are proactive, they are not reactive. These things are already in place before students come through the door. Teachers, staff, admin has a plan before the students arrive. So we're not a reactionary environment, we are proactive in dealing with behavior. There is a removal of this assumption that all students come to school ready. It's systemic, so we're managing behavior by teaching students the behaviors we want them to exhibit, and we are teaching this explicitly through lessons, through discussions, through conversations that are engaging. The Office of Special Education Programs has defined PBIS in this way. It's a decision-making framework that guides selection, integration, and implementation of best evidence-based practices, both academic and behavioral, for improving important academic outcomes and behavioral outcomes for students. So the emphasis under school-wide PBIS would then be, in order to get these outcomes, right, we need to make sure we have data, we need to have practices in place that support the data, the evidence, the things that we know work, and we need to have systems. All right? So all of this, the data supports our decision making, practices support student behavior, the systems support staff behavior. And in the end, the outcome we want is social competence and academic achievement. So how does this trickle down to classrooms? Teachers, once again, have to provide direct instruction to every single student regarding classroom-based expectations. And they should be directly aligned with school-wide expectations. So if at ATMA middle school, if at MA middle school we are polite, prompt, and purposeful, then in our classroom we are the same. There's really no need for any extra rules. These will be the rules or the expectations that are applied throughout the building. So when we teach, we're going to have detailed instruction on what these behaviors look like in the classroom setting. Here is an example school-wide PBIS plan from George Washington Middle School. Now, what I like about this, I do think there's a lot here, and in some cases, especially for smaller children, it's going to be, too much. However, this was a result of the administration and staff sitting down and deciding what preparation, respect, integrity, dedication, and excellence would look like in every single area of the building. What does it look like in the classroom? What will we expect in hallways? What will we expect in bathrooms, cafeteria, etc.? After the staff took the time, administration took the time to develop and hash all of this out, then there was a period set aside, I guess it was more like an enrichment period, because this was middle school, during the day for the first pretty much 6 weeks of school, and then actually expected, to review throughout. But there was time set aside to actually teach these, have lessons created to go through all of these, go through these expectations, what it looks like and doesn't look like everywhere in the building. Kids had conversations about it. They had conversations about what it looks like, what it doesn't look like. They actually did activities to support this behavioral expectation so that everyone in the building was on the same page. So you might ask, well, what if my school does not have a school-wide PBIS plan? At the very least, you have to take the steps to apply these principles to your classroom. So you have to, once again, remove the assumption that they already know and actually teach what you expect of them. I think some key things always for teaching is you can't have too many rules or expectations. 3, maximum 5 usually work very well. And you have to hash out with the students what those things look like and do not look like. Remember, and the key thing about all behavior is that students feel safe when they know what to expect. If they know what to expect, they are more likely to behave. And PBIS provides that consistency and reliability. Here are some ideas for how you can explicitly teach behavioral expectations. So here's some sample activities. Doing role plays and acted outs are very helpful because you're creating scenarios and actually, engaging in the active work of rolling out what these behaviors look like. Analysis scenarios, doing any analyzing in whole or small group discussions, doing comparing and contrasting activities, drawing or writing what each specific expectation looks like, juxtaposed to what each does not look like. Frayer models would be useful for this because you can give examples and non-examples plus an image. Socratic seminars, analytical discussions with rules for engaging are also helpful. So these are just some ideas of activities that can be used to teach behavioral expectations in the classroom. One of the things we also cannot forget about is consequences. So not only do we teach our students what we expect of them, we also teach them what happens if they don't meet the expectations. They need to know that before something happens. Once again, creating that safety net for students that allows them to behave in a more preferable manner. So consequences for behavioral infractions should be explicitly taught. They should have a logical progression, and they should be clear, simple, reasonable, and enforceable. So clear and simple, I think, speaks volumes. Reasonable meaning the behavior or the consequence should fit the behavior. And enforceable. We can't give kids consequences that we are not going to follow through with or that we are unable to follow through with because we lose our credibility. How do we explicitly teach consequences and possible activities, cause and effect? Right? If A, then B, graphic organizers. Games are also very useful and helpful. You can do all kinds of game templates such as Jeopardy, or you can, once again, play acted outs, role plays, have the student become the teacher. How would they respond in a certain situation if a student did a certain behavior or did not meet a specific expectation? Socratic seminars and analytical discussions, once again, where kids can engage in discussions about specific scenarios and come to conclusions together. Why are Tier 1 best practices essential for inclusion? Because it provides a foundation in which to build and execute the secondary and tertiary tools for students with disabilities. I always say think about a wedding cake. When you have a wedding cake, it has tiers, and the bottom tier is the most robust. It covers a larger surface area. It's wide. That makes it strong enough to support the other two. Without that, you have a cake that's all over the place. It falls. So I'm a really big proponent of focusing and making sure that the Tier 1 pieces are in place when assessing student behavior and how to deal with student behavior in the most effective way. Why are Tier 1 best practices essential? Tier 1 tools level the playing field for students with disabilities. So it's the idea of saying we know that we've done everything that we're supposed to do that works for most kids. If those things aren't working, then we need to go and take it to another level. It's extremely difficult and oftentimes impossible to support secondary and tertiary needs when primary needs are not being met. When Tier 1 is not working, keep in mind that statistically speaking, 80% of students should be successful. They should be able to function with just Tier 1 support. For those who continue to struggle, then we might need to look to Tier 2, and Tier 2 support should be readily available for any students who need them. So what does Tier 2 behavior management then look like? Some ideas: behavior contracts, check-in, check-out procedures, so you can have a check-in, check-out list. If they're in middle school, it might be, beginning of the day homeroom, end of the day homeroom, depending on the intensity. It could be check-in, check-out for every class. Daily behavior forms that students carry around with them, and their behavior is assessed at intervals. Functional behavioral assessments and behavior intervention plans when we need to figure out target behaviors and then how to address those target behaviors. Self-monitoring checklists, peer mentors or adult mentors, counseling, and sensory tools and assistive low tech. These could be basic things like fidgets, Velcro under the desk, so that students can focus a little bit more and they have something to play with while they're listening or being attentive or doing whatever they need to do in class. So these are just some examples of Tier 2 behavior management tools. Why is access to Tier 2 support necessary? You have to have a cache of interventions, and they should always be available for approximately at least 15% of the students who will need them, who will need a little more intensive support. They need to be there. And the law actually requires evidence of various interventions having been tried for a reasonable period of time before referring a child to special education services. So Tier 2 needs to be there in case you have students who might need Tier 3 support. Student support teams are great resources for this. If you have a group in your building who is simply responsible for managing student support teams, they can deal with sort of the interventions and follow-up on progress, etc. Tier 3 is special education. That's pretty much the way to think of it. Statistically, it should only be approximately 5% of your students with behavioral concerns. We can take it up a notch to maybe 5 to 10%, but it should not be, too many students where we're dealing with behavior solely behavior because of their special education needs. However, we know we have these students. So in Tier 3, this involves some intensive assessment to make a disability determination. The interventions need to be documented in the student's IEP, and sometimes a student may require separate day schooling. These are the most extreme cases, maybe 1% of the time. What do they look like? Placement for specialized instruction. It could be co-taught classroom, self-contained classroom, or special day school, as I said before. Sometimes it may involve physical restraint, so it's really important to know your students, and if physical restraint is required as a safety mechanism in your building for both students and staff, then there should be the appropriate training for staff to be able to intervene in that way. Clinical supports could be counseling for social workers, school psychologists, clinical psychologists. Once again, functional behavioral assessments and behavior intervention plans. And then discipline, um, manifestation determination reviews if required. It's really important, I think, to take a moment to understand discipline from a special education perspective. So, because this is a question that often comes up, and figuring out how to deal with students in the tier 3 realm, so they're getting special education services and they have to be disciplined. Um, so once a student is at risk of missing 11 or more days of school, and they do not have to be consecutive days, and these are due to suspensions, it's important to remember that the 11th day constitutes a change of placement. So the school should first be diligent about scheduling manifestation determination by the 10th day, no later than the 10th day. And if they decide that the behaviors were or are a manifestation of the child's disability, then an FBA should be done, a BIP should be done, the IEP should be reviewed and adjusted so that the student's services adjust accordingly. If the behavior is not a manifestation of the student's disability, then the school can continue with the disciplinary action as assigned. However, they still have to provide special education services, and that can be done via homebound or other types of instruction as the team decides until the student is allowed to return to school. So in any and all cases, local education agencies are responsible for educating any and all students with disabilities. So if a disciplinary action requires their removal from school, they are still required to make sure that child gets services in some way, shape, or form. So what are our takeaways for behavior management? Most important is to be knowledgeable about Tier 1 supports and use them. Okay? Use all of the Tier 1 supports that you can. If we do the things that are just good to do for all kids, oftentimes most kids will be successful and will be able to function in those environments. If you've exhausted every possible resource in Tier 1, then you should get support from Tier 2, your school student support team and support staff, for tips, advice, resources, and alternatives. And always remember, I think it's important to remember that at the Tier 2 level, it's not always about, sometimes it's not always about fixing the behavior of the student, but thinking about how staff can change their behavior. I do have a question, so I want to answer the question first. Okay, the question is, once the student gets the 11th day of suspension, does the school have to move forward with placement, or does that just constitute the justification to start the conversation of placement? So just quickly going back to that, once the student gets the 11th day, it is a change of placement. That in itself is a change of placement. So the idea is you need to have sat down and had that conversation by the 10th day about whether the behavior is a manifestation of the child's disability. Then if it is, if the team says yes it was, then you need to adjust the IEP, the services, etc., to try to improve. And the student just stays, obviously, at the school with whatever changes in service the team decides needs to happen. If it is not, then it's still, once you got to day 11, it's still a change of placement, but you just have to adjust the services. So you might have to talk about, okay, well, the child's going to be out of school for 45 days, but we still need to send maybe someone to do tutoring or whatever services that they need. They can do it at home, or maybe I've done it before where we arrange for a location for a home bound teacher to meet with the student at the library, etc. Does that make sense? Does that answer the question? Robin, does that answer the question? Okay, so if the manifestation is yes, we change the service hours and location. It may not necessarily be the service hours or location. If it's yes, you as a team decide what needs to be changed. Does the child need more hours, or do we just need to change how we're serving them? Um, does that make more sense? And if it doesn't, we can sort of talk through that separately if you'd like. Okay. So once again, just to clarify, if it is a manifestation of the child's disability, the team decides what needs to change. Do they need more service hours or no? Maybe they need, different goals. Maybe they just need to add counseling, whatever. It totally depends on what the team decides. All right. So, oops, sorry. If you've exhausted every possible resource in Tier 1, definitely seek out supports in Tier 2. When Tier 2 supports have been implemented with consistency and fidelity, and I say that it's very important that they be done with consistency and fidelity, and a student continues to exhibit behaviors that don't allow them to be successful in the educational environment, then a referral should be made to determine whether the student has a disability. Students with disabilities require that their services and supports be implemented with consistency and fidelity as well. So discipline, we have to make sure when we deal with discipline, it needs to be done within the scope of the law to avoid any problems. I wanted to share this really awesome resource for you. If you've never been there, go check it out. It is pbisworld.com. They have a plethora of Tier 1 supports and ideas that you can try. They have really strong support and advice on implementing Tier 2 and 3 supports. There are data tracking sheets there if you ever need to do some data collection and tracking on students. And they give you strategies for almost 40 different categories of behavior. So definitely check that out. It's pbisworld.com. I can sort of click on it now, show you. So you can click on a behavior, right? What do I do if I'm dealing with hyperactivity? And they give you sort of a blurb and, share with you what that behavior looks like and what you can do. So you click on behaviors, tells you what it looks like, and then At the tier 1 level, they give you all kinds of ideas, breaks, consequences, rewards, praise. Um, tier 2 level, the same. Same for tier 3. And you want to do some data tracking, they give you all kinds of sheets and tools to use. Okay, so definitely check that out and get some ideas. Should be pretty helpful. Oops. And that is all. If you have any questions, you can feel free to contact me at malderton@specialedcoop.org. So you can take a minute to go ahead and jot that down. And are there any other questions at the moment? Okay, well, thank you for attending. And like I said, feel free to send me questions you have. This is, once again, a very general sort of overview of how we should think about framing behavior, and so that we can intervene appropriately. Behavior is such a huge topic. There's always so much that we can talk about. But I think if we understand these basic sort of foundations and structure, this is the best place to start in every school. So thank you again. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. Thank you for logging on.